My mother stopped being able to read maps about a year before she died, and that is how I found out about Blackwood. She had been a surveyor, not the modern kind who stands next to a tripod that talks to satellites, the old kind, who walked property lines with a chain and a level and came home with mud to the knee. She raised me on the smell of ammonia from the blueprint machine and the belief that a map was a promise, a place made about itself. So when the dementia took her ability to hold a folded county sheet and tell me which way was north, it frightened me more than any of the other losses, because it was the loss of the thing she had been. Near the end, in the memory care place off the highway, she got fixed on one idea. She would take my hand, she didn't always know it was my hand, and she would say, "You have to go tell them the water's still there. They keep drying it up on paper, and it isn't dry." I'd say, "Where, Mom?" And she'd say, "Blackwood," like I was slow. Blackwood, where we lost the Petrie boy. And then she'd be somewhere else, 40 years back, and I couldn't follow her. I looked up Blackwood after her funeral because I couldn't sleep, and grief makes you literal. You can't fix the person, so you go and check the fact. Blackwood Reservoir. It took me one search. It had been built in the 1930s to supply a mill town that no longer exists, and it had been decommissioned and drained in 1971 after the dam was found unsafe. The water let out slow through notches cut in the concrete over the better part of a year, the valley given back to the creek. 50-some years ago. My mother would have been a young woman when they drained it, long before I was born. There was no Petrie boy in anything I could find, but the reservoir was on the map I was looking at. A blue shape, a proper hydrographic polygon on a state environmental map with a revision date from 2 years ago. That's the part I want to explain carefully because it's the part that took me the longest to stop explaining away, and I have some standing to do so. I do this for a living. Not surveying like my mother, I'm a GIS analyst for the state. I verify map data before it goes out, dam inventories and watershed layers and the like. So when I saw a drained 1971 reservoir sitting on a 2-year-old official map, my first thought was the boring, true thing that is almost always the answer: legacy data. Old features get dragged forward when data sets are rebuilt from older ones. It happens constantly. Somebody didn't scrub the source. I actually felt relieved. It was a data hygiene error, the kind I fix on a Tuesday, and it let me turn my mother's dying obsession into a solvable problem, which is what I wanted more than anything. So I did the boring correct thing. On Monday, I pulled the feature, traced its lineage, found the stale ancestor layer, and put in a correction to have Blackwood removed from the next publication cycle. Clean, done. A small, tidy act on behalf of a dead woman. I want to be honest about what happened next, because the temptation is to make it sound like a haunting, and it wasn't. The feature came back. Not dramatically, the next quarterly refresh simply had it again. And when I checked, the correction had been applied correctly, and the feature had reappeared from a different source data set than the one I'd cleaned. I fixed that one too. It came back the following cycle from a third. I am telling you this as a professional. That is not how legacy error behaves. Legacy error is a single stale root you pull once. This was the same shape arriving from unrelated places over and over, each source insisting it had gotten Blackwood from somewhere upstream, and every upstream saying the same, a chain that never terminated in a person who had ever put it there. By then I could have written it up and let it sit as an open ticket, the way 100 anomalies sit. I didn't, and it wasn't because I'm brave or thorough. It was because of the Petri boy. My mother had said we lost him at a reservoir that had been dry for a decade before I existed, and I couldn't get her voice out of my head. And I realized that somewhere along the way I had stopped trying to fix a mapping bug and started trying to understand what my mother had been trying to tell me before she couldn't tell me anything. So I did the thing that broke it open, and it wasn't clever. I stopped looking at the maps. I got in my car and drove out to where the water wasn't. It's about 3 hours, most of it on roads that get smaller until they're the kind my mother would have walked. The last stretch isn't maintained. The reservoir, on paper, sits in a narrow valley the creek runs through, and the old grade of the access road follows the creek up. I parked where the grade washed out and walked. It was October, cold, the light already going amber by mid-afternoon. I expected a dry valley, 50 years of the creek cutting back down through its old bed, cottonwoods grown up on the flat where the water used to be, maybe the stump of the old dam. That is what a drained reservoir looks like after half a century. I have seen them. The land forgets fast. The land had not forgotten. There was water, not a full reservoir, but where the valley pinched and the old dam still stood lower than it once was, notched and broken where they cut it in 71. The creek had pooled behind it into a long, still, dark body of water that filled the bottom of the valley for maybe a quarter mile. Groundwater, I understood immediately, and I want to be clear that this part is not mysterious. When you drain a reservoir but leave the dam and the valley's water table sits high, the ground itself seeps and the low ground refloods. It's well documented. Nature refills the bowl. There was nothing impossible about the water. What stopped me on the bank was that the water was being kept. The old dam had been breached in 1971. I'd read the decommissioning report, the notches cut, the concrete left to fail. But the notches were closed. Someone had filled them. Not with a contractor's forms and rebar, with fieldstone and mortar, and, over the top, mismatched bags of sacred gone hard. Courses of it laid up by hand over what must have been years, decades. A patient amateur's masonry holding back the seep so the bowl stayed full. There was a length of black poly pipe running the water off at a controlled level so it wouldn't overtop. There was a little concrete pad by the outlet with a valve wheel on it, greased. It was maintained, not by an agency, by a person. I found him by the second dam. There was a second smaller earthen berm upstream, newer, and beyond it, set back in the cottonwoods, a cabin, a real one, lived in, a wisp of wood smoke, and an old man sitting on a stump at the water's edge with a coffee can of hooks. Not fishing, just watching the water. The way my mother used to watch it in her chair at the end when there was no water to watch. I told him I was from the state and I'd come about the reservoir. He didn't seem surprised or afraid. He seemed, if anything, relieved, in the exact register my mother had been relieved on the days she thought I was someone who could finally carry the message. He asked me who my people were. I told him my mother's name. He knew it. Of course he knew it. He said she'd been out here as a young woman on the survey crew in 69 or 70 before they drained it, when the state was mapping the valley for the decommissioning. And then he told me about the Petri boy, and I understood at last what my mother had been trying to say for a year with a mind that could no longer hold a map. His name had been Danny Petri. He'd been the old man's younger brother. In the summer of 1970, before they drained it, He'd drowned in Blackwood, gone under near the old intake and never come up. And the water was deep and dark, and they never recovered him. And the next year the state drained the reservoir, a scheduled thing. The dam was bad. It had nothing to do with the boy, and the old man had stood on the bank and watched the water go down day by day, expecting to see his brother. And the water went, and there was nothing, only mud and the old town foundations, and no boy at all. They never found him. The valley took him and gave back everything but him. So I keep it full, he said. He said it plainly, without drama, a man explaining a chore. He'd come back years later, an adult, and found the bowl trying to refill itself from the ground, and he'd helped it, closed the notches, held the water. Because as long as there was water over the place his brother went under, his brother was still somewhere, still held, not lying exposed and forgotten in a dry valley nobody visited. A drained reservoir is a grave with the lid off, he said. I put the lid back on. That's all I've done out here. That's all it is. And the maps. I asked him about the maps because I still had the analyst in me and I needed the loop closed. He almost laughed. He said that back at the beginning, when he first started holding the water in the 80s, he'd had a friend of his brother's, a man who worked, as it happened, for the water authority, a draftsman, and this friend had known what the old man was doing and had thought it was right and had quietly never let Blackwood come off the operational maps, had kept it in the data sets as an existing water body so that the state's own systems would always forever account for a lake at the bottom of that valley, so that if anyone ever drained it again, the maps themselves would object, so that Danny would always be somewhere, on paper if nowhere else. The draftsman had died a long time ago, but he'd done his work the way careful men do. He'd seeded it into the source data, the root layers everything downstream is built from, so deep and so early that every modern data set assembled since inherits Blackwood as ancestral truth and hands it forward to the next. And no one alive knows how to find the original hand that placed it, because there is no living hand. It isn't the government preserving a lake. It's one dead draftsman's act of grief, still propagating through machinery that has no way to tell love from data. Every time I deleted it, the system healed the wound, because a man had built the wound to heal. I did not go home and file a correction. I sat with the old man until dark, and he showed me the valve and how he ran the water down a few inches before the winter freeze so the ice wouldn't push the old dam. His hands are getting bad. He's older than my mother would have been. He asked me, near the end, not in so many words, whether when he couldn't do it anymore, someone might keep the water. Whether I might. I told him about my mother, about the years she spent trying to get someone to go tell them the water was still there. He listened, and then he said the thing I drove 3 hours home turning over, and that I am still turning over. She wasn't confused. She just knew a true thing she couldn't get anybody to write down. I went back, and at work I closed the ticket. I marked Blackwood Reservoir as a verified existing water body, current, and I entered the field observation in my own name with the date and the water surface elevation I'd measured with the level I inherited from my mother, and I let the maps keep it. Not because a system beat me, because it was true. There is water at the bottom of that valley. I stood in it to my boots. A grieving man built it back with his hands, and a dead man wrote it into the bones of the record so it could never be taken away again. And my mother spent the last clear year of her mind trying to make sure it stayed. And now I'm the one who knows. The maps were right the whole time. It was the world that had tried to forget, and a few stubborn people who wouldn't let it. I'm going back in the spring to learn the valve. When he can't hold the water, I will.